I'd like to welcome everybody today to the Noisy Reality show we're doing. And we're very, very pleased to have Professor Jonathan Haslam joining us to talk about his new book, Hubris, The American Origins of Russia's War Against Ukraine. Professor Haslam has been the past George F. Kennan Professor in the School of Historical Studies at the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton. He was for many years the professor of the history of international relations at the University of Cambridge. Professor Haslam has studied at the LSE, Trinity College, Cambridge, and the University of Birmingham. And he's lectured and taught at the University of Birmingham, Johns Hopkins, University of California, Berkeley, King's College, Cambridge, Yale, Harvard, Stanford. And he is a great treat to have us here. For those of you on the audio and on the video who will listen to this later, I wanted to just go over quickly some of the great contributions he has made to our understanding of international affairs, and in particular the Soviet Union. His trilogy of books on the Soviet foreign policy in the 1930s, absolutely essential reading. I recommend them highly. Also, it's interesting that one of the books he did was on E.H. Carr, who all of us know is the author of The Uses of History. And this particular book, of course, was quite important, but E.H. Carr's works on the Soviet Union, his multi-volume history of the Soviet Union, absolutely essential as a basis of understanding to understand the Soviet Union and the phenomena that was created by it. These books, of course, are dated. They're old school, but nevertheless, it's good to start with old school when you're trying to understand a complicated situation like the Soviet Union and Russia. His later books included a book on Allende, the Nixon administration. He did a history of the specter of international communism and the origins of World War II, a study on Soviet intelligence. And we're talking with him today about Hubris, which is a look at the American origins of the war in Ukraine. So it's very, very pleased to have you here, Professor Haslam, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
First of all, I'd like to start with a discussion about, before we turn to your very rich book, I want to talk about the situation we're in right now. We have, depending on how you look at it, essentially a inflection point in American history, American foreign policy. We have a president who's come into the White House and essentially topsy-turvied the Atlantic Alliance in short order in the past few weeks. We had the situation where he essentially broke with the previous administration on the dealing with the war in Ukraine, putting into question NATO. So we've seen NATO literally for the past few weeks scrambling in Europe to have a coalition of the willing formed in lieu of the fact that we may very well see Trump withdraw from Europe. And I wanted to get your reflections about what's going on right now with this new situation with Trump in the White House, Trump 2.0.
Yeah, it's an invidious job to come to office, whoever you are, and find yourself in a situation where you want to create some sort of pacification in Eastern Europe, basically to get the Russians to withdraw from Ukraine and to allow Ukraine to reconstruct. That's how I see the mission. It's complicated, partly because it's Donald Trump. So his, how should I say, his negotiating style is, well, I mean, it was on television in the States for about 6 or 7 years, is peculiar to himself. It's very much individual centered. I don't know how much collective decisions are made in the White House on Ukraine, but one gets the impression that he reckons the professionals have fumbled the ball and that he needs to go on the pitch and deal with the problem. But you have to set this against what there is in the White House, which is a sort of grand vision, a collective vision of how to create a new world order financially and economically. And this is, so you have to see Trump's approach on Ukraine is actually a segment of this. It's as much to do with the Secretary of the Treasury as it is with the Secretary of Defense. And that's why this very peculiar early proposition of the United States investing in rare earth mining in what effectively is central eastern Ukraine fits in. I mean, when it was first raised by Trump, it just seemed utterly bizarre. It didn't fit anywhere. To Zelensky, it just didn't just seem bizarre. It seemed something much worse. But effectively, what Trump was, I think, trying to offer was that if the United States, forget NATO, if the United States was physically in Ukraine, making vast amounts of money out of mining in central eastern Ukraine, you didn't need security guarantees to make sure the Russians didn't come back in. So in other words, once you got them out, if the United States was literally in there digging away into shovels, this was a guarantee of sorts. Now, I don't know anybody who knows, and I don't even think Trump knows, how we get from there through to a full settlement in which the Russians pull out of Ukraine and Ukrainians get their country back. I don't think they know how they're going to get there. I don't think Putin knows. But there's an important aspect on Putin's side. First of all, there's the issue that I deal with in the book, that all this arises from the United States bid originally to take Ukraine within NATO, to expand the alliance even further east. And secondly, that Putin appears to be looking for something more. In other words, not as the crazy NATO European people who want to create some crazy defense budget want, seeing he's going to annex all his neighboring countries is absolute bizarre nonsense. He's looking for some close relationship with the United States to give Russia some sort of level of equality in the world as a superpower with the United States, the sort of thing Brezhnev always wanted to do, and Andropov and Gorbachev. In other words, not only does Trump have a larger vision in which Ukraine sits somewhere, but Putin also has a larger vision. And this I think makes these talks highly personalized. In other words, until we actually get Putin sitting down with Trump, we won't know what sort of peace settlement we're going to have. We won't know the full shape of Ukraine. We won't know how much territory it will have lost. Not until we get to that point. And I have no idea how far we are from that point so far.
Okay. Now, before we turn to the book, let me raise some other issues that are important for this present situation, and that is your understanding about the kind of political economy moves of Trump. That is his tariff strategy, which he's initiated right from the start. And of course, to the average American, the idea that this is not going to be passed along to them is, of course, ridiculous. Of course, it's going to be passed along to them. But also the question how that interrelates to the kind of peace that could occur in Ukraine. One thing is clear, that they want to not have any kind of alignment with NATO. There's a neutrality issue that is going back and forth in the debates. But how do you see these political economy issues, which to me actually strike at the core of a transatlantic relationship, but But how do you see that before we get into the meat of the book?
Yeah, I mean, effectively, Trump is trashing the post World War II and the post Cold War international system. He's basically saying, look, America has given and given and basically been ripped off by its allies. And I would say that's completely accurate on the defense front. What you do about it is another question. When you look at the EU, I mean, the EU was created as a protectionist bloc. It was created on the presumption of high tariffs. The United States used to be a high tariff country until 1944. So the Europeans are doing to the Americans what the Americans used to do to the Europeans. This has to end. I don't see anything wrong with that. That China rips off the United States with high tariffs. Why should the United States put up with that? I don't see why they should. In other words, what he's doing by use of the tariffs are a bludgeon. They're not an endpoint. They're a bludgeon, a means to an end. And it's a brutal economic means to an end. But frankly, the Europeans say, oh, we'll put up our tariffs even more against you. Well, you can slit your throat and jump down a well, but it's not going to prove anything. The Europeans say, oh, we're going to have lots of money spent on defense. How long will it take for the Europeans to start building defense industries all over again at a new level of technology? I mean, we'll be a decade away. And then all this warmongering talk about sending troops into Ukraine. The Russians won't allow troops in Ukraine if they're trying to make a peace settlement. This whole business is about keeping NATO out of Ukraine. And it's bizarre because the British scarcely have an army left. The Air Force is having to deal with patrolling the Baltic Sea, patrolling the North Sea, patrolling the Houthis in the Gulf along with the US Air Force. We don't have anything spare. So there's an air of unreality about European policy on these questions. Now you're fixing on the unreality of Trump's end of it, but it's a balance between the two. And in the end, Trump is going to slash European tariffs. It will make the European Union completely redundant because its only purpose for the French is to keep everybody else's goods out of their country. The Germans are beholden to the French. And I don't know if you read the politics of the EU, but they're scarcely talking to one another. I mean, to get the Hungarians and the Italians and the Greeks to agree to what the French and the Germans are proposing is almost impossible. And you could see that the failure of the EU led to Brexit. Brexit wasn't some peculiar British dream. It was years and years and years of banging their heads against a brick wall created by France and Germany. So to me, the EU is totally dysfunctional. And if Trump's threats of tariffs actually help break it down into a more normal assemblage of states that are cooperative, more free trade, open to the world, it can only be to the good. Now, in this, Eastern Europe has to play a role. Ask the question, who is going to pay for this ruin, the ruination of Ukraine? Who is going to rebuild the Russian economy? The Russian economy, despite what Putin and others say, is flat on its face. It's got massive inflation, huge labor shortages, low morale. It's run by a dictator who's not been listening to anybody. Otherwise, he wouldn't have gotten into this war in the first place. These countries have to be rebuilt. Where's the money coming from? Who's going to raise the money? So instead of raising money to fight World War III, the Europeans should be thinking about raising money, raising like 100-year bonds in order to pay for the capital reconstruction of the new Ukraine, and then build on Russia's huge advantage in commodities. No country in the world has more in terms of commodities than Russia. I think the only thing it lacks is chrome. they have everything else, and we're going to come when the US stock market crashes, we're going to come into a commodity boom. The only thing that's going to be valuable are hard items like commodity. In other words, Russia will benefit from the next commodity wave that's coming through. And so there is a synergy there for the United States, Europe, and Russia. But we can't carry on in these fossilized institutions that were given to us from the Cold War. They should have been cleared out in the early 90s. But you know, bureaucrats like their jobs; they like to hang on to them at whatever cost, and they have done at great cost to everybody. So I really see if you go to sleep now and wake up in 5 or 6 years, you're going to see a very different horizon in Europe and transatlantically. And I think if it's done, okay, it's brutal at the moment, but I think it can be done in a more humane, sensible way, as long as we start talking. And the Europeans made no attempt to talk to Russia for 3 years, and the United States did not do so either. And we have to get through into negotiations.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's go back into the beginning of this story in your book, which is the Bush administration and the collapse of the former Soviet Union. Uh, and people at that time argued, well, why keep NATO? Why bother? This is an archaic institution. Why retain it? And how do you see that in the Bush administration? I'm thinking, of course, the famous memos at the end of the Bush administration that were leaked about how the United States should dominate the world. I
Mm.
actually had a friend of mine who was Assistant Secretary of Defense, and I called him up. I said, "What the hell are you guys thinking, man? You know, like what kind of BS is this? I thought the Cold War was over. Like, why can't we use that money for other purposes?" And unfortunately, I asked him to come on this call today, which would have been fun because he's changed his mind over the past 30 years. But nevertheless, that raises the question of why did NATO expansion creep into that situation early on?
Yeah, it's something those of us reared on realpolitik and balance of power and the rest of it found very hard to understand. And Europeans are constantly caught on the back foot because they think United States foreign policy is sort of made like European foreign policy by professional diplomats sitting quietly in a dark room with maps and seeking the most rational means to every end. But of course, United States foreign policy, the United States is primarily and preeminently a country with a huge hinterland. It's a democracy. Every member of the House, as soon as they get elected, is trying to work out how to get re-elected. So this does two things. First of all, it opens them to massive corruption, corporate corruption. Bernie Sanders isn't totally wrong. And it also means that they are very susceptible to shifts of public opinion. And if there was one man who was sensitive to shifts of public opinion, it was Bill Clinton from Arkansas. I mean, nowhere could be more distant from DC than Arkansas, even if you'd been a couple of years at Oxford and you'd been at Yale Law School or wherever. And Clinton's sensitivity to public opinion and his, as it were, urge to be re-elected, then came into collision with the deep state. The deep state just got ever deeper during the Cold War, as everybody's finding out looking at the JFK documents. My goodness, the deep state getting undressed on film is what you've got in those JFK documents. Well, if Kennedy was worrying about it, by the time you got to Clinton, it was a colossal concern. Now, the Bushes, the Bush 41, Wolfowitz in particular, there were people in the Pentagon who dreamed of, basically dreamed of world domination. I mean, the Chinese aren't wrong. They dreamed of American hegemony everywhere. And when Bush suggested to François Mitterrand, the then French president, that they expand NATO to cover the rest of the globe, Mitterrand said, no, we're not discussing it. And Bush was very offended and insisted on discussing it later. And Mitterrand said, we never accepted this idea. It shouldn't be on the agenda, more or less. Go away. The Europeans met these new hegemonic ambitions from the United States under Bush 41 with disdain. And then when Clinton came in, Clinton didn't have a foreign policy, as was said in Arkansas, it's the economy, stupid. But Clinton sort of felt, he didn't feel quite right about that. And he was persuaded to have a foreign policy. And it was handed to him by the Brzezinski people, effectively, let's make Eastern Europe our priority. Let's finally put the Russians away. And this is where the idea of the expansion of NATO that was already mooted by three countries in Eastern Central Europe, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary. They wanted future protection against a future Russia. Yeah, but Russia was on its back. Russia wasn't about to attack anybody. It couldn't even win a war against the Chechens internally. There was a complete mess, and the economy was in a complete mess. So this was at a time when something constructive could have been done with Russia, but instead, the Clinton administration, embarrassed by the fact it hadn't got a foreign policy, and completely tied up in knots by the emerging what I would call civil war in Yugoslavia, the war between these ethnic entities in Yugoslavia that were intent on atrocities at every turn. I mean, if you look at the Clinton archives, the presidential archives, every meeting is beset with a discussion about Yugoslavia, and they ended up not being able to agree on anything. There was a civil war in the administration over Yugoslavia. So they thought, well, is there anything we can agree about on foreign policy? So they said, oh, what about NATO? What about expanding NATO? That's a great idea. Bill can go to Eastern Europe and everybody thinks America's their savior. And so they went ahead with that. And then when the deep state got into writing the agenda, of course, they popped in, oh, let's include Ukraine. Why not? No one's going to notice. Strobe Talbot, who was supposed to be Clinton's point man on Russia, Bill Clinton, he knew Clinton well enough from living with him in Oxford. So, but basically Clinton cut him out. And he cut out the Secretary of Defense, the Deputy Secretary of Defense, the Joint Chiefs of Staff. All of them wanted a rapprochement with post-Soviet Russia. And they weren't allowed in the room, basically. It was all decided behind everyone's back. No one knew Ukraine was going to be called into NATO. The Ukrainians hadn't been asked. The Baltic states weren't then asked. No one was asked, really. It was a catastrophically ignorant way of making foreign policy. It really was a disastrous way of proceeding. It took the Russians quite a while to realize what was going on. They thought this splendid gentleman, Bill Clinton, with the big smile and the big hug, was going to be everybody's friend and Yeltsin's friend. He was a big man. Clinton liked big men. Yeltsin was a big man. They embraced each other like bears. It was complete deceit. And whereas Poland was forgiven, all of her debts, all of her international debts were forgiven by the usual mechanisms involving the United States and the IMF and the IBRD. Russia was not. And when Jeffrey Sachs, who managed the Polish debt, went to see the Secretary of State under Bush and said, okay, can I now get going on Russia? Can we forgive Russia's debts? And the secretary said, no, of course not. He basically got a clip around the ear and told to go away. So nothing was done to rebuild Russia. There was no Marshall Plan. There should have been. And if the United States had had, as it were, physical investments in the new Russia, if it had had an attachment, if Russia had been, as it were, attached to the US economy at that stage, there's no way someone like Putin could have got elected and then pull Russia apart. It was, and it would have meant that the Democrats in Russia had a chance at becoming president. But when, the world economic crisis in the late 90s destroyed the Russian stock market, it wiped out all the middle class savings. It was like 1929 for Russia. And Weimar in Germany, it wiped out all of their savings. And I had friends over there who were very reasonable, Democrat, liberal-minded people, insofar as Russians can be liberal, which is a bit of an if. But they were pro-Gorbachev, they were pro-Western, they wanted change. And then the terrorism started from the Chechens, who ran the mafia market, one of the main mafia markets in Moscow. And then the Chechens wanted separatism, and they planted bombs, and it was ghastly. So there was no law and order. All the tax authorities were totally corrupt. So, you got your taxes reduced by paying the tax man on the side. Everything was corrupt. There was no proper legal structure at all. Now, the United States could have done an awful lot to change Russia at that point. There was a decade, really, from the end of the Soviet Union, basically 1991 to 2, through to the election of Putin. That was the period in which the new Russia was being configured. And I had direct insight. I was involved in declassifying Russian Foreign Ministry archives. I was on a committee. You could take the temperature in Russia as we visited, dealing with archives year by year. By 1995, we gave up. We washed our hands of it because the KGB was back. By 1995, the KGB was back. Putin moved from Petersburg to Moscow. And basically, it became a mafia state. It became a mafia state. And Yeltsin put Putin into power in 1999, effectively, because he felt Russia needed a strong man. Russia needed to stand tall against the West. The West expanding NATO was a threat. So it's very easy to look back. But when we were living through it, you could see this was a disaster in the making. It was a disaster in the making. The only light at the end of the tunnel came when Tony Blair came into office before Putin and before Bush 43. And Tony Blair, on the advice of the head of MI6, Defense Intelligence, and all these people, the diplomats in Russia, we had some good ones in those days, they weren't all MI6, they basically said to Blair, there's an opportunity here before Putin comes into office to win him over and open the door, open NATO's door. Now, not fully, but partially. So Russia had some investment in the new order. And that worked quite well until George Bush got in. And it wasn't Bush. Bush was had a great deal of charm, and if you didn't get his back up, and Putin actually personally always liked George Bush a great deal. But Bush was, a puppet of the old men he'd brought in from the previous Bush 41 regime, and that was Cheney, and that was Rumsfeld. And Condi Rice was completely useless. Because she would never stand up to the president, which meant that when an argument came by, she wasn't going to stand up to Rumsfeld and Cheney, and Rumsfeld constantly ridiculed her. She had a very hard time in the White House, and her parents had died. So Rumsfeld, when the opportunity came to get the Russians locked into NATO in some form, which was Blair's proposition, Rumsfeld didn't turn up at the meeting. And when Rumsfeld didn't turn up at a meeting, the decisions weren't made. Bush always backed down. So Rumsfeld effectively blocked any participation of Russia, even marginally, in proper NATO proceedings. You can't tell this from just reading the headlines in newspapers. Everything was covered up. The Russians didn't talk about it. But by 2004, which was when the Baltic states come into NATO, Putin's mind was made up. If you won't let us in, okay, we're going to stop you advancing eastwards, basically. I've been told that's when Putin made up his mind. It was the Rumsfeld decision. The Baltic states came in. Once the Baltic states came in, they didn't want the Russians at any meetings, even loosely advisory meetings. They were so hostile because of their horrendous experience at the hands of Stalin and his successors. So the tragedy begins to unfold. The only option I haven't mentioned, the key option, was the Europeans do it themselves. But, when the United States, when daddy's always there and mummy's always there, your spoilt teenager doesn't feel they need to do anything. And that was really what Europe was like. Germany was the country with all the power. Germany was the powerhouse of the European community. And Germany had the dead weight. If Germany decided on something like the recognition of Croatia, which was a world disaster that led to the full fighting, no one could do anything about it because Germany could bribe anybody to agree with them. But when the German Chancellor Kohl, was asked by his national security advisor, I've spoken to him quite a bit, look, can we sort out Yugoslavia? Can we create a new European architecture for Europe? That was the proposal. In other words, get rid of NATO, build a European architecture in Europe in which Russia would find a place. Kohl said, no, I'm too busy, because Kohl was trying to renovate Eastern Germany and make it like Western Germany. It was costing a fortune. Plus, he had to worry about the French, who were paranoid because Germany was reuniting. And the French were worried Germany would dominate the new Europe, just like Mrs. Thatcher was worried. So this didn't happen. So in other words, it's a combination of US preemption towards global hegemony, basically, the expansion of NATO, the beginning of that policy, which Brzezinski originally advocated, but in 2014 realized it was a huge mistake with Ukraine and wanted the US to back down. And this idea of a European architecture and the Russians could find a place, the Russians were very, very keen on. Certainly Yeltsin was. So this is a real chain of disasters. Now, obviously, you can't roll back everything. These events have happened, but there are certain lessons from it. Firstly, you do not kick the Russians in the teeth when they're lying flat on their backs, which is essentially what Wolfowitz, Cheney, Rumsfeld sort of people were quite happy to do, and think there's no consequence, that the Russians won't ever get back up again. Well, what's happened to that one? Secondly, the Europeans, really, it's sort of time the teenager left the house. Oh, are we losing sound?
Go on, sorry. Yeah, you're there. You there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Sorry, go on.
Okay, so in other words, it's time the Europeans grew up in terms of running their own affairs. And to the extent they ran their own affairs, they ran their own affairs on a rather narrow, self-serving economic basis. So the Germans hooked up German industry, BMW, Siemens, and the rest of it to Russian natural gas, to Russian energy, regardless of the political consequences under Putin. And the French, as it were, kept their tariff barriers up, and the vain British attempts since the mid-70s to try to open up the European community and then the EU as a trading bloc that would be less introverted and more open to the world, that was a complete failure. No one was going to agree to that. So we've got the actions of the United States and the failure of the actions of the Europeans on the political field. And then you've got the consequences of treating Russia badly in the 90s. Putin is a consequence of the 90s. We would have had any number of interesting characters as future presidents of Russia who were very keen on reform. And under Putin, they got assassinated. That was the consequence. I mean, who paid the price for these policies? Up to the time Russia invades Ukraine, Putin invades Ukraine. Russians always say Putin. This so-called war measure, military measures, special measures, was Putin, not Russia. But the people who suffered most were, God knows, I mean, more than 100 journalists have been murdered in Russia. These potential new leaders have been assassinated. The last head of the opposition poisoned several times to get him out of the way. And then the Russians start exporting their assassinations abroad to kill Litvinenko in London, former, not very nice guy, former KGB man, London, and then Skripal, who was also former intelligence guy. They tried to murder in Salisbury in England. So the West has began getting the consequences of these policies, I would say, from 2006, 2007. But the Russians have been feeling the consequence of those policies basically since 2002, 2003, when it started to become dangerous to express your views in Russia.
Wow. Well, for those on the call, just raise your hands and I'll get to you. We'll take your comments and questions in order. One thing I just wanted you to clarify is I remember hearing in the early 90s, everybody was talking about out-of-area operations by NATO. They were constantly talking about that. And you had the Partnership for Peace, you had the war in Yugoslavia, and that, of course, was a NATO war. NATO involved itself militarily in aiding Croatia and using air power to achieve an aim. So how does Russia get treated in that situation?
Yeah, well, the first thing was, having decided to keep out of Yugoslavia, or former Yugoslavia, the United States ends up going in. And when it does go in, it goes in heavily and basically to destroy Milosevic, leading the Serbs. This was done, the bombardment of Serbia for, what was it, 7 or 8 months. It was done as an action of NATO without any turning to the UN. So in technical public international law terms, it was ultra vires. It really, along with the crash in the Russian stock market, it destroyed pro-Western feeling in Russia at that point. So, yeah, Serbia was defeated. Milosevic was defeated, was then hauled up on trial So they created an entirely new international legal structure, basically, just to get Milosevic and his friends. Since then, they've only moved against African dictators and Netanyahu. There's something horribly morally corrupt about anything related to that period connected with Yugoslavia. It was really a disaster for NATO to act out of area in that manner. And then it was worsened still by giving Kosovo independence, also against UN strictures. And this was a kick in the teeth also for the Russians, who chose to present themselves as the defenders of the Serbs for largely historical reasons. But some people said, and this is what the Russians picked up, that the real reason for going against Milosevic and bombing Belgrade was to save NATO. This was what people thought. This is nothing to do with liberating anybody. It was to save NATO, because otherwise NATO looked completely redundant. And even though all these East European countries were joining it, it was completely useless for anything. And I'm afraid sending the bombers in often makes decision makers walk tall. And the invasion of Iraq, which was, as you know, opposed by Germany and France, and most Britons at the last minute when it was decided to go in and invade, and Bush 43 rings up Tony Blair. I know from inside the British Embassy that when Bush was elected, Tony Blair's instructions to senior members in the British Embassy was, they said, well, what should we do now? Have we lost?
No, that's okay.
Okay, what should we do now? And the instruction came, get up the backside of the Bush administration and stay there. And that's effectively what Britain did uncritically, and went along with everything. The French and the Germans intermittently offered objections to the expansion of NATO, but nobody took any notice, basically. The British always said, yes, yes, we oppose it completely. And then when they sat down with the Americans, they said, what a great job you're doing. Perfidious Albion, as normal. So this was, but the invasion of Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11. The invasion of the destruction of Saddam Hussein was on the desk in the White House in January after Bush's election. It was a priority. It was going to be done by the agency, but in the end, they realized something heavier would be required, and then so they went in full force.
I'll do a couple of quick questions. Maybe you can comment on. I'll put out three things. One, if you could say a few things about when I look at this type of the global politics playing out between the unilateralists and the globalists. So the unilateralists looking at U.S. particular interests, financial interests. I think both the globalists and the unilateralists are controlled by corporations, so it depends on who corporations are backing. If you could say something about that, and then also you mentioned that the U.S. has been dominating the defense spending of the world, and that somehow we're owed something for that, all that defense spending. But in a way, it seems like the U.S. benefits from the fact that we are the global currency, and as a global currency, we run deficits, both trade and budget deficits, and effectively those trade deficits end up having to recycle those dollars back in that pay for our budget deficit. So in a way, it seems like Michael Hudson talks a lot about this. It seems like we're actually the West, the collective West, is actually paying for all this defense spending the U.S. makes. And then kind of like a third thing is it seems like in the whole NATO and everything, there's when we talk about the collective West against Russia, there's a huge overhead cost of rents because of the way the West has been financialized. And it seems like that means that, the U.S. to produce you know, a large bomb is going to cost, maybe 5 or 10 times as much as it would cost Russia to do that. And so this presents kind of a balancing effect in terms of like thinking about waging a war in Ukraine. It's costing the West way more than it costs Russia to fight this war, at least in terms of equipment and so on. If you could comment on that. Thanks.
Yeah, I think yeah, you've hit upon a couple of key things. One of which is, euro dollar. I mean, the dollar is still the world's currency, and it means, unfortunately for you, that the Europeans pile into the New York Stock Exchange and buy everything going, and then will leave at a turn of a hat. I mean, they're starting to run for it because they think the market's too toppy and might collapse. So that openness of the United States financially creates a potentially very damaging liability. The second point is the reaction against dollar dominance you've seen over the last 2 years is that we have had more central bank buying of gold in the last few years than absolutely ever. China's still low on gold as reserves. It only has 5% of its reserves in gold. Poland is heading for 10%. I mean, Poland's an ally. So what's happening is there's an ab reaction against dollar dominance by the BRIC countries of the third world, and that's likely to continue. So, in other words, I remember General de Gaulle, everybody must remember General de Gaulle, saying in 1967, oh, les Anglo-Saxons, nothing could be good. And that the Americans were exporting inflation to the rest of the world because they dominated the international currency system. And that's still true. That's still true. That's not changed. But there are forces at work to change it. In other words, what I think certainly the Secretary of the Treasury is trying to do is to rework these international economic and financial relationships to break with that past and to try to make the United States healthier economically internally, and obviously less dependent on, for example, carry trade with Japan or whatever. So we're getting into the the interstices of the system. As to whether you may, with the United States, for example, selling vast amounts of armaments to Ukraine, well, who are they buying them from? American arms companies. So when Trump talks about all the billions that have gone to Ukraine, actually they've gone straight back into Lockheed and the others. So I don't know why they cry into their milk about that one. So I think there has to be, I mean, it depends on your view of the outlook of the American economy. But by any calculation, the US markets are somewhere heady near 1929 levels. And it's not going to be sustained. It means because of the interdependence of all these countries in the dollar bloc, that when it comes crashing down, everybody else's will come crashing down. And it will often take a disaster to reorder the world economic order that was done in 1944. And I think, and you could argue 1971 too, when Nixon went off gold, because it was the Vietnam War that ruined the dollar in that period and created the basis of inflation of the 1970s. So I think we are actually heading in that direction, and all of what we're discussing now with Ukraine and that will seem like small beer compared with the problems we may face further down the road. But in all these cuts that Doge is making, I'm waiting to see whether, the deep state, in particular the Pentagon, is seriously cut. I have doubts. About that. But if it's not cut, I don't see how the deficit can be paid for.
Yeah, well, Project 2025, basically, I compare it to Andrew Jackson when he came into the White House. Basically, they want to replace a bureaucracy with their own bureaucracy. But Ralph, go on, Ralph.
Yeah, thanks. I'm really gratified by the fact that you don't come across as an apologist for Putin. I've long thought, I've long puzzled over this as to why, Russia wasn't offered either eventually becoming part of NATO or preferably for NATO to be dissolved and for for Europe and the Atlantic powers to have a new security architecture. And I'm wondering how you would have built that new architecture if if you would have been in favor of it.
Yeah, I think the greatest opportunity was before Putin comes along, under Yeltsin. That was when Western influence was at its height. I would basically have said to the East European countries, the Visegrad group, Hungary, Poland, and Czechoslovakia, we will admit you into what is now NATO on one condition, that Russia also comes in. They will have immediately said, "Oh, forget it. we don't want to join a club with them in it." And then you could have started to say, "Okay, let's frame a new European architecture for security." And then talking about the early 90s, after Russia recovers from 2000% inflation, then you could have started saying, so what are the synergies between Russia, its former republics like Ukraine, and the West? So the obvious synergy is Russia is the raw material producer. The Europeans are the big consumers, particularly the Germans. So in other words, what you would needed to have done was to lock in security guarantees and economic dependence. In other words, they should in some ways have become so tied in together that no one in Russia would contemplate bringing to power a former officer of the KGB who might upturn the boat while they were so dependent on Western goodwill. What made Putin bold was the change. We came into a new commodity cycle at the end of the 90s. The price of oil, I think, was $14 a gallon or something at that time. And then all of a sudden, commodity prices went through a new wave. And of course, that lifted Russia enormously. Remember, Russia, under Yeltsin, undertook all of the debts of the former Soviet Union. All the debts of Ukraine and all these other countries were going to be paid for by Russia. And when Jeffrey Sachs tried to get Washington to do something about this, it wasn't interested. But the rise in commodity prices effectively released Russia from that sort of debt dependence on the West. So Putin comes to power at a critical moment where he doesn't need the West so much. So in other words, there's this, if we were doing what you wanted to do, the best time to do it was certainly before the crash of the Russian stock exchange in 98. But then after then, following Blair, would have, Putin was still interested. He wanted to be seen as respectable. We didn't know how bad he could get. But I had a great friend who used to be in charge of Russian things at MI6. I remember I got to know her in the House of Lords. I did some work for them, and she said to me, "You know, Jonathan, no good will ever come of making a former KGB officer president of Russia." And I frankly had to agree with her. I mean, that was the break point, really, in 2000, 2001. I think if Russia had then been let into a larger structure, we would have really had some ruptures and problems with it. But, you know, maybe we could have done something. But the time to really do it was before 98, which meant it had to be done by Clinton. But unfortunately, this was a man with absolutely no real core interest in international affairs, except as a photo opportunity. And, you know, and unfortunately, Mrs. Clinton, as far as I could see from a lot of her statements, had a rather more neocon view of the world, you know, American hegemony. And that wasn't going to work very well.
I wonder, do you differentiate yourself at all from Mearsheimer and Walt and the Quincy Institutes kind of?
Yeah, you know, I know some of these people. The thing is, there's some aspects of American political science which leave me cold. One of them is the so-called offensive realist school, which I do find offensive. It's the I used to know and like Ken Waltz a lot, and Ken was a Democrat who was what was called a defensive realist. He viewed the balance of power as very, very important, but he voted Democrat, and he was, you know, Mearsheimer's a different animal. He's an offensive realist. He predicted at the end of the Cold War that Germany would go to war with the rest of Europe. You can read this ludicrously insane article in International Security in the early 90s. And then because they say, well, the United States has to do what it has to do, and it has to be realist. And then when the United States doesn't do it, they tell the United States off because it's not doing what the laws of international relations tell it should be doing. I find their entire position completely insane. It's a sort of Euclidean view of international relations. And so, in other words, what I'm saying is they don't really understand international relations with real countries. They know nothing about Russia. They know nothing about Europe. They've demonstrated it in their writings. So all they want is it's a chessboard, and, you know, we're guilty. The Russians are innocent. Too bad about Ukraine. I just can't go along with that. I have Ukrainian friends. I have Russian friends. And these are real countries with real people who are suffering like hell. And I don't view these sort of justifications as morally acceptable, basically.
Well, thank you. And I guess with Mearsheimer, what do you expect with a guy who did a dissertation on Little Heart? Craig, come on, Craig.
Yes. Hello, Professor. I've really enjoyed your talk. I've found myself shaking my head up and down so many times. I think I sprained a muscle. But I just have an observation. I'll try and keep it as short as I can. I'm curious what you think of it. Obviously, Trump wants to end this war because he wants to put it behind us and pivot to Asia and China, where our real problems are. But both Zelensky and Putin are resisting a ceasefire, which is just a start. And I'm wondering, I mean, Putin is clearly winning this war. He's been clearly winning this war for maybe a year and a half now. So why would he want to stop at this point? And one other thing, I recently read, I've spent the last 25 years of my life writing books about Operation Barbarossa. So I know a little bit about the Eastern Europeans. And I remember reading Niall Ferguson's book about wars in the 20th century. I believe it was called War of the Worlds. And it was just unbelievable what happened after the 22nd of June, 1941, when Hitler attacked the Soviet Union. I mean, all these old, you had people in this areas where Poles had married Lithuanians and Jews had married Catholics and so on and so forth. All these historical animosities surfaced. You literally had instances, and it's just emblazoned in my brain. I was stunned reading this, where husbands killed their wives, or wives killed their husband because one was of a Ukrainian origin, one was Polish. I mean, my point is, and also the Balkans, which you talked about, I just don't think the Eastern Europeans are like us. They will fight until the last man is standing. And my final point is, neither Zelensky nor Putin can be seen as losers in this conflict, because they could end up losing their lives if they were. And one thing I know for sure, Putin is never going to give up the 4 oblasts, the 2 in the Donbass, and then Zaporozhye and Kherson, that he's captured. That would be the end of him personally. And so how do you agree with what I said about these Eastern Europeans as being just kind of a different animal, and the fact that Putin is just never going to give up these terrains? He had these territories. He in the fall of 2022, I believe it was, he had the referendum. These areas are very much ethnically Russian. He's never going to give them up. So how do we even begin to think of peace when this is kind of the situation we have?
Okay, well, that's a lot.
Yeah, sorry.
That's okay. Yeah, I'm doing some.
We've got a lot of guys today who have a lot, Jonathan.
Yeah. Okay, let's boil it down a bit. I think the assumption behind what you're saying, one of the key assumptions you're making, is judging the progress of the war entirely by the battlefield. And as you know, if you looked at 1941, the invasion of the Soviet Union, if you added up Soviet forces, air forces, land forces, everything, and then added up the German forces, we're not counting Romanians and others, you know, Hitler should not have been able to progress down the 𝐀𝐦𝐞𝐫𝐢𝐬 highway to Moscow. And eventually, of course, Stalin was able to push him back, you know, in after September, when the snows came in. And then we had push me, pull you all the way through to the end of the war. Why? It was because it was not just about military power. It was Stalin wasn't ready. He didn't think the Germans would attack. He believed MI6 assessments that the Germans just wanted to negotiate through strength, and they were completely wrong. It was a disaster, but it was a political disaster, and it was a disaster of one personality in charge of the country. Now, with Russia today, I defy anybody to show me anything that's appeared in mainstream media which shows what's been going on inside Russia since the war began. And when I do get access, I read the Russian press, and of course they can't say what's really happening. It's been the strictest censorship since the war began. But you can see from the economy what a total mess the economy is in, there would have been riots, mass demonstrations in the street if Putin hadn't got out his special forces at the right time. You go out in the early days on a demonstration, and the police would head for you, beat you over the head, and the second thing they did was grab your mobile phone. They took your mobile phone out, tracked every number you had, every name you had, and then left you with a dilemma. Do you go back home and not come out again? Or do you want all of your friends rounded up, put through the grinder like you? And cutting off Russia from the web, the World Wide Web, etc., etc. The repression has been amazing. If there hadn't been that repression, Putin would have been thrown out of the Kremlin a long while ago. Russia internally is in desperate need of peace. They've got a huge labor shortage. One of the reasons their rate of inflation has been horrendously high, in double figures all this time, is because they're bringing young men onto the battlefield through the sausage machine, and a lot of them aren't coming home. So Putin needs peace. Now, there's a point you do raise in that respect, which is relevant, which is, would Putin, indeed Zelensky, survive a peace? Because they're the war leaders. They've got to win everything they said they would win. They can't both win.
Yes.
That's why Trump is there, to make sure nobody wins. But the point is that you were right about the ethnically. I think we have to be careful how we phrase it. I would say Russian-speaking areas of Ukraine, Donetsk, Zaporozhye, Crimea. Crimea was never really Ukrainian. It was given to Ukraine by Khrushchev in an illegal act in 1954. So now there's a lot of mess there. Yeah. I have proposals that nobody would ever listen to, because since I've been working on this subject in Britain, which is supposed to be a democracy, what J.D. Vance said about free speech in Britain is quite true. That basically the press and Whitehall government departments crack down. They just go quiet on you. You can't get anything published. And were it not for YouTube, we wouldn't get anything out there at all, or these podcasts. Yeah. My book was not reviewed anywhere in Britain except by the Daily Telegraph, by a 23-year-old graduate student who knew no Russian and worked in an aid program in Ukraine. That's how they shit on you, if you excuse the expression, in this country. Not surprising, no one knows anything about what the situation is in Russia or politically in Ukraine. Both leaders are very vulnerable. And my view is that when a peace is actually settled, within months, neither man will be in charge of their country. Neither will be in charge of their country. But my emphasis here is, don't just look at the battlefield. Yeah. Of course, Russia has more people to push through the sausage machine than Ukrainians. Ukrainians, to my amazement, you could, in Britain, in World War I, which was a war we should never have fought, in my view, but we'll go into that some other time.
Yeah, right. No,
we had 15-year-olds. We had 16-year-olds go to war. In Ukraine, they don't conscript anyone under the age of 25, for God's sake. How can they say their country is in total jeopardy when you've got 18 to 25-year-olds swanning about at university, for goodness sake? A lot of them go across the borders. They go and get Social Security in Germany or wherever. There's so much corruption on both sides. Russia is equally corrupt. You can meet Russians on holiday in Turkey, and you're thinking, hang on, you're 18. Why aren't you at the front? So what you say about Eastern Europe, I won't go along with all of it, but it is a different world. They have different values. They do not value human life in the same way. And that's why such a bloody war can continue for so long. But the hope for peace is that actually both sides are pretty much exhausted. But it is the responsibility of the Western media to expose what's going on, really going on in these countries. You know, we get no exposure at all. If I had to say something about Western civilization, is that the worst possible thing that happened was this Wuhan virus, courtesy of China and the US Defense Department, which put us all inside a prison camp for a couple of years where we couldn't say or do anything for ourselves. It's going to take us a long time to recover the values of civilization. But as you say, the peace in the East will be made difficult by the fact that our standards for civilization are not theirs. And if we have a peace, territory is going to be lost to Putin and to Zelensky. My proposal would be that Crimea goes back to Russia, because if you ask any Russian, they would say that. But the areas of eastern Ukraine, Donetsk and Poroshensk, etc., they should come under international jurisdiction like Trieste did at the end of World War II to prevent a war between Italy and Yugoslavia over Trieste. In 1947, we made it an international territory under the UN, which lasted through to the mid-50s when there was a final settlement. In other words, it shouldn't be any longer under Putin's control, but it shouldn't be directly under Kiev's control. And then other things could be worked out later. Anyway, that's my feeble suggestion.
Well, I find your point on the internal situation in Russia very interesting. I am unaware that their situation, I know they've suffered with inflation and other things, but their situation is so dire, as you've put it, and that because of that, Putin desperately needs to end this war. So I don't know, maybe that is leverage that Trump and the others can use to try and end it, and maybe that is some cause for hope that this conflict, this utterly insane, ridiculous conflict that never should have happened, can be brought to an end.
Yeah, I agree.
Thank you, Craig. Oh,
sure.
And thank you, Jonathan, for mentioning my hometown, Trieste. Anyway, go on, Mike. Go on, Mike.
Yeah. First of all, one can also argue that because of Europe's attitude towards Germany in the post-World War I era, it was a major cause of the rise of Hitler. Of Hitler gaining power. Okay, we all know that, right? But what it comes down to is, yes, it is. I agree. It's that there was a window of opportunity with Yeltsin to, shall we say, forestall any of the things that have happened since, and to forestall the rise of Putin. But the fact is, you can't take the same attitude that you would have then now, because you're dealing with a different animal, just as we were dealing with a different animal when Hitler did come to power. So, and I think that's what you're suggesting. We can't undo the past. There was a mistake made, but we have to deal with how things are now and who we're dealing with now. But yes, Jim, you did say that Russia, you said towards the beginning that Russia is looking to have a shared, shall we say, for lack of a better term, world domination with the United States. I would say that.
That's not quite what I said, but go ahead.
No. Please say it, because I don't want to.
Oh, no. What Putin's looking for is a sort of special relationship with the United States. This is I always thought it weird. You may think not, but when Brezhnev and the others were always going on about, I mean, it's all about gestures. It's all about touchy-feely. It's all about being on stage. They're not talking about world domination. They're talking about this wasn't to be a bipolar dominance of the world. It was, well, with Russia, first of all, free itself from the clutches of the Chinese. I mean, this is something you can't say in Moscow, but what everybody thinks. Oh my God, this has been the result of the war in Ukraine. We are now sitting on the lap of the United States. So what the Russians want is a freedom from this incubus, and they want to be treated nicely by the United States. Now, Trump is good at that sort of thing because he's used to dealing with, you know, mafiosi trade union leaders in New York, and everybody's his friend, Kim Jong-il, you know, Mr. Xi, you know, everybody's his friend until they fall out with him. Trump is good at doing that sort of thing, making Putin feel special, making him feel good. That's what the Russians want. I know you probably think this is absolutely insane because who the hell does that help? But that's the mindset. Your previous speaker was saying about the sort of mentality of people in Eastern Europe. This has to be borne into account. You're not dealing with normal people in the sense of Western rational people. You're actually dealing with something very different. And it's something actually within the deep state, the best people in CIA, that's what they learned during the Cold War. That's what they learned. That's what they got through to Reagan, was how to handle people like Gorbachev and the Russians, that they're different. In fact, the former head of CIA, unfortunately, wasn't kept on. He was associated with Biden's regime, but he's the best Russianist the United States has. He really understands all this. And they need people like that to advise them how to handle the Russians.
Let me just, before you respond to that, Michael, you know, I know people who left the federal government because of this NATO expansion issue in the 90s. They quit. Colonel David Glantz retired from the U.S. Army because he was angry about this. But I should add that, you know, you have a lot of New Yorkers here, so we know about nutty people from Queens. But go on, Mike. Go on, Mike.
And I'm one of those nutty people from Queens.
Yeah, but you don't have orange hair, Mike.
Yeah, no, I don't. Far from it. But I can tell you that we've known about the particular nutty person from Queens that we're all suffering under for quite a while. And that, by the way, thank you for clearing that up. The problem is that what we have in right now is an administration, for whatever reason they're doing it, that is obviously creating a great deal of chaos. But also, you talked about the bludgeon effect of tariffs. But what he seems to be primarily bludgeoning, with the exception of China, his friends and his allies, or the friends of the United States and the allies of the United States. And in doing this, he is causing some permanent damage to the relations with U.S. allies. I mean, we can see this with Canada. And the idea that we have an administration that, at least in the eyes of these allies, cannot be trusted, basically, that they've gone back on policies that they themselves, on U.S. policies that Trump himself enacted, that Trump himself endorsed, and then he's gone back on it. Does that not diminish the ability of the United States, except you could say, you can certainly say it would still have some economic power and obviously military power, but it diminishes the role of the United States in brokering any peace in between Russia and Ukraine. I mean, if you have something that can't be trusted and a country that isn't even trusted by its allies, then what role can the United States, I mean, in other words, I don't want to say it can play some sort of role, but does it not diminish the U.S. role in brokering any agreement in Ukraine?
Yeah, that's what I hear from some people, that the Europeans will do what they're told. They know who's master of the house. They'll suck it up. Don't worry. I'm afraid for those who don't like Trump or don't believe he can succeed, this is a very weak argument. A stronger argument would be that the American domestic situation, the American domestic economic situation is much more worrying and troublesome than the administration understands, although I would have thought the Treasury Secretary fully understands it. What Janet Yellen left them with is an absolute disaster in terms of the federal budget. The weaknesses are on the American side, and I'm not sure how Besant can overcome these. If I were running the State Department or Defense Department or the agency, I wouldn't worry about the Europeans at all. You sort it out, they'll come running. They, in the end, want, despite what they're saying, they want an end to this war. The war has been so costly. It's sort of helped destroy part of the German economy, to say the least. Europe's flooded with refugees from all over the place and refugees from Ukraine. The Europeans want to see all this over, but they don't want to seem weak. And when you're negotiating with Trump, of course, his whole idea is that you seem weak. So in public relations terms, if you worry about that, it's been a complete disaster. So if you're a State Department official charged with Europe, you're going home and hitting the bottle every evening. But I wouldn't worry about it. We've been through worse before, much worse before. Remember when France decided she was going to build her own nuclear weapons and walk out of NATO? She did. NATO didn't collapse. We've got more countries in NATO now. They've got deeper pockets. I mean, I wouldn't worry about the Europeans at all. Trump, this whole problem was started by the United States. Russia was the object of this mistaken policy. It was a decision made in secret, kept from Congress until the last minute, and from every Russian specialist I know of in the United States, except for Mr. Fried, who was on the National Security Council, who was pushing it. And this has to be a peace settled between Washington and Moscow. The Ukrainians are the victims in the middle. So some settlement has to be done, which helps Ukrainians. But in the end, it's an American-Russian problem. And Trump sees it that way and will try to solve it that way. I can't see the Europeans, from what I've read, and I read loads about Europe. My wife's German, for example, and I know what's going on in Europe. The Europeans couldn't manage a tea party at the moment. They're in a complete mess. They can barely talk to one another. They're not the people who can bring about peace in Ukraine. So don't put any money on them at all. And as for this big amount of money they're going to raise in order to build up all these defense industries, well, the Hungarians have said no. The Italians said, I'm not sure about it. The Greeks said, no, thank you. And when you require unanimity, how are you going to do it? I mean, I've never seen, and it's not because I supported Brexit, but I've never seen the EU in such a total mess as I've seen today.
Thank you. And it's amazing they're arguing about the Vendôme Manifesto in the Italian parliament, which just amazes me. Alex, go on, Alex.
Yeah, again, thank you so much for this, for a good book that I enjoyed reading, your analysis today. Wanted, I guess, to start, both Lavrov and Putin have talked about, the US, and again, they're not just talking about Trump, or they're talking about the past few administrations being non-agreement capable, that at this point, the Russians, because the US has, broken treaties, except for, the strategic nuclear forces, isn't doing, arms control anymore, that they basically can't, and because of things like, how the two Minsk agreements are essentially now revealed to be, Trojan horses, and that they were never intended to be followed, and it was just an excuse to arm Ukraine for the coming war. I just wonder again, from taking into account Russian fears, how you think, if U.S. government did want to allay Russian fears and kind of get back into that arms control process, how could they do that or do you think it's just such a broken relationship that's not coming back? Thanks.
No, when I was talking earlier about the Russian, or it was Soviet obsession with seeing of having a relationship of equality, formalized equality, it very much hinged on all these arms control agreements, which I was always very skeptical about. First of all, you spend vast quantities of money on armaments, then you reach an agreement with another country that you'll only build so many more for the next few years until the agreement runs out. And then you invent some other ghastly weapon system which you hadn't thought of, and the other side wants it as well. And then after a few years negotiation, you make another agreement. This is sort of the salt start thing, and it gives great jobs for people who have Russian and have a career in the State Department or in the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but it doesn't really do very much. But anyway, it's a sort of it calms people down. It gives them something to focus on. It's cooperative, as trade can be cooperative. It's sort of soft power. I'm in favor of it, and Trump has actually indicated that he wants to go in that direction. And I noticed in the Russian press they really latched onto that. Now, Lavrov, well, he's like a sort of an old, ugly, grizzly bear who's there. If the mother can't get the child to go to sleep at night or he's misbehaving, she threatens him with Lavrov because he's such an ogre. And so don't listen. Rather like with Trump, that's what I learned. I lived in Trump land while I was at the Institute for Advanced Study. So I went through the whole first term. And what I learned from that was you don't listen to what Trump says. Never, never listen to what Trump says. Watch what he does. That's, as it were, the residue, the key residue. So there's a lot of misinformation out there. On the other hand, there are people in the administration who are pretty smart, particularly the Treasury Secretary. So you want to listen to them, and you may want to listen to the Pentagon chief. I don't know yet. But with Trump, just look at what he does. And Putin is taking the same view. So I think at the moment we have a lot of high-level rhetoric, hysteria, mostly by Europeans, but you also have it in Moscow. Once they get into face-to-face real negotiations for the peace itself, not this peculiar partial ceasefire, then you'll see a decrescendo of this rhetoric, And that's what we need to listen for. In other words, what we need to keep our ears open for is when the hysteria dies down, things go quiet. When they go quiet in Moscow, I can always tell because I watch the foreign intelligence service has a website, and I always know when the head of Russian foreign intelligence is busy in the Kremlin because he stops writing on the website. He just goes AWOL like for a week or 10 days. And I can tell he's tied up in stuff. He doesn't have time for all this. And it's gone quiet at particular periods. I'm waiting for it to go completely quiet for like 2 or 3 weeks where they're working out their negotiating positions. And they must be wargaming their negotiating positions at the moment in interagency meetings at the Kremlin. And I hope the Americans are doing the same thing. I'm not confident that Trump would organize such a thing. But so, in other words, don't listen too much to what they're saying. Just watch who's going to Moscow, who's gone to Saudi, when is Trump actually going to physically meet Putin? Remember, these telephone calls are bizarre because you've got one guy on the telephone speaking English to his interpreter, who's then putting it into Russian and then phoning it through to Putin. And then Putin understands a bit of English, but he's going to want it in Russian. And then you've got a translation back. What you need to do is have them together in a room. And remember that Putin is a very, the first year of training for a KGB officer, it's not changed, is psychology. I mean, individual psychology. That is it. So dealing with a foreign leader, you've got to remember that with Putin, that how he dealt with Obama, whom he loathed. He only met him once and then spent the whole meeting telling him what a mess American policy was. And Obama barely opened his mouth. Or like Putin got on terribly well with the former Israeli Prime Minister, Naftali Bennett, who tried to put together a peace twice in the year of the war. And he got on with him. Why? Because Bennett's a madman in a sense. He was a commando leader. I mean, he just sort of went into a village and wiped out anybody who was connected with Hamas. I mean, he makes the current Israeli prime minister seem like a teddy bear. And of course, Putin related to him immediately. They got on like a house on fire. You couldn't separate them. Well, you can imagine with Trump, big man goes in blustering like a big bear. So there's a lot to this personal, you may think it doesn't amount to anything, but this interpersonal behavior that could make a real difference. And when you look at the Europeans, who have they got? I mean, who impresses you for personality? Macron, well, when he's with his wife, but, otherwise, not really. The Germans, they're awful. Their leaders are awful. And they're partly responsible for this mess because they never stuck up for themselves.
How about Ursula von der Leyen? She's a really impressive piece of work, isn't she?
Yeah. I think she had lots of children, didn't she? Anyway, if we're serious, then I think Trump, personality-wise, could make a difference with Putin. And this sort of suggestion that somehow the Americans and the Russians will find areas of cooperation will be a relief to most Russians who don't like the Chinese any more than the US does. This will be a different sort of world order. But from the European point of view, as long as this war ends and then we can start trading instead of shooting, they won't mind who's in the White House if they get that done.
But on the other side, with what your Prime Minister Starmer and Macron are saying, they're talking about, deploying peacekeepers, and we're basically, well, if the U.S. isn't going to, fund and send weapons to Ukraine, we'll do it on our own, essentially. I mean,
Yeah, well,
what do you think there? And we can see, right, since
yeah,
German, they're talking, that they're pushing through a budget to greatly increase their military, which is, I mean, haven't we done this twice before in the past, 150 years? So actually, I wonder what you think about, are they serious? Is this whole idea of Europe, building their own independent military?
Yeah. Well, certainly the British Prime Minister's not at all serious, hasn't a clue what he's doing. His administration's a complete disaster and is going to grind the British economy into the dust. So I don't see that as much of a contribution. The British made a very serious contribution to the Ukrainians early on in the war, which is when Biden was standing there in the middle of the road, blinking like a rabbit in the headlights after the invasion. Even though the deep state had warned of the invasion, he really hadn't got a clue. And that's when the British stepped forward, the British Ministry of Defence, and start organizing for resistance, including, undercover warfare, commando troops who'd already been training Ukrainians. So the British have a capability, and that's why the Russians keep throwing out our diplomats in Moscow. I don't know if you ever noticed, but as soon as we send a band of young people of the right color, the right gender, I don't think we've sent anybody transgender yet, but if you look at the photos, you're thinking these people, they've not done anything. And then I can tell you from having lived in Moscow, particularly under this lot, that if you haven't got experience, you're dead in the water. So they regularly PNG our young hopefuls who've been recruited on a woke basis, who seem pretty clueless to me. It's a disaster. But the British are strong in that other area, but that's not enough to make a difference to Ukraine war. That kept the war going, but it was not enough. And political leadership in Britain is new but weak. In France, it's old but weak. In Germany, it keeps changing, but it's still weak.
Yeah.
Okay, Frank, you want to unmute?
Well, before Frank, I just want to make a note that, of course, Naftali Bennett was in the Soviet Makhal, the Delta Force of the IDF. And so that, of course, is something that Putin probably got off on. Go on, Frank. Frank, you have to unmute. Oh, getting there.
Can you hear me?
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Thanks. I agree with you that the United States has done many, many wrong things in its past. And given the MAGA majority, I think the worst was the Louisiana Purchase. That was a big mistake. But your premise that it was Clinton and the fact that they didn't take advantage of the situation and somehow bring Russia into the fold, I mean, that assumes that the Cheka / NKVD, KGB, and now FSB had all disappeared. It hadn't, and you know that. You didn't get into the presidential archives. You got into pretty far in, but you didn't get all the way in. And when you say that Andropov and Gorbachev wanted to get cozy up with the United States, well, their precedent was Stalin. Stalin got cozy, and he got cozy through human intelligence, through human espionage, and he got very cozy to FDR. And without that connection, there wouldn't be Lend-Lease and all the other things that went. And you wouldn't have Russia becoming the next most powerful entity on the planet, or hegemony, with the Warsaw Pact. That's what happened. And so They needed a reprieve, and they got it. They brought the house down themselves. We didn't bring it down. We didn't do the, Cato the Elder, Carthago delenda est, which we probably should have done. We didn't do that because we're the United States. Now, I've been British and I've been Australian, and I'm proud to be an American at this point. Well, until Trump came on board, maybe. But yeah, we didn't do that. We didn't sow salt in Russia. We allowed their KGB, as it's now called. I mean, we could have renamed NATO Teletubbies, but we didn't. We kept it NATO. They renamed their KGB, FSB, and SVR, which was, okay, that fooled us for a while, right? But we knew that we should have known that they were simply biding their time. And that's what they did. And then they put Putin in charge. Very clever all the way through. Okay. And there's no question about it that we allowed them, through our own ineptness, you're right, to do what they did and eventually become capable of doing a third-rate invasion of Ukraine. So I am disappointed to hear somebody who's written so much about the Soviet Union to suggest that we are somehow at fault for what they did. And when you say Russians as a whole, you're not talking about Russians as a whole. You're talking about a very elite, select, and very well-educated human intelligence side of their apparatus. They are not good at technology. They are not good at industry, but they are very good at converting useful idiots. And there are so many over here, and they're working as hard as they can on Europe, because Europe is a democracy. You call it what it is. We haven't seen Germany, France, and Britain, possibly Italy too, and possibly Spain, and Finland, and Sweden, all on the same side. God help you if they do get their act together, because you're within spitting distance, if you're in Estonia, to St. Petersburg. So God help them, the Russians, if Europe decides to, okay, we'll stop the babble of cacophony of democratic stuff and start talking as one entity. Now, it depends what the useful idiots over here. Wyckoff, what a classic example. Whoa, scary. But yeah, it depends what happens with MAGA. It really does. But I fundamentally disagree with the idea that it was Clinton. Clinton was, you're right. It's the economy, stupid, and I don't want to deal with anything else. Got it. And he did. But, we should have made sure that they didn't have 3,000 nukes. Didn't do that. That big mistake. But they've got a big brother, and that's what you haven't mentioned. Russia has a big brother, and that's China. If China wants to come in, we got problems. But by themselves, nothing. They're not a threat. But if China comes in, yeah, you're right. You're right. We would have a problem. But I fundamentally disagree with some of this stuff that you're saying. I'm sorry.
All right. Thank you, Frank.
Read the book. It's about evidence.
All right, Julian.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Haslam. It's a fascinating discussion. Unfortunately, I'm going to be Frank Radford too. I'm wondering if your proposition about the missed opportunities for negotiation are perhaps exaggerated. I mean, I saw an earlier discussion with one of the members here about a similar failed opportunity to take out Hitler, which I think if we recall why there was no intervention against the rising Hitler, it would make us recall how difficult it is to do a diplomatic intervention. The French went into the Ruhr Valley. The Ruhr Valley didn't put pressure on Germany because a democratic country can't actually bayonet the local civilians. It actually gave Hitler's movement one of its first pushes. Go back to the 1990s. If we had aggressively confronted the Russians, it would have been the equivalent of the Ruhr Valley. Putin would have been put into power in an accelerated, probably in an accelerated fashion. I mean, I understand your discussion of the personalities. I mean, these are politicians. They can be odious, but I think there's simpler explanations for a lot of the failures to engage Russia. Just like collective action, it's really difficult to both preserve democracy and have countries coordinate a single policy. Given the complexity of we focus on a leader, but of course they've got a political party to deal with and electorates and side elections. It is incredibly complex. Now, you can have a dictator. We know what happens there. I mean, if they get the policy right, things are great. If they don't, it's, Xi Jinping today with 24% unemployment. And of course, foreign policy is always a balance between power and liberal values, or not liberal necessarily, but the domestic values of the society at the time, which sometimes are woke. They're sort of extreme. I'm wondering if there's an easier explanation. I mean, there was discussion about the Serbs. I grant you, it's very difficult on the battlefield sometimes to distinguish the atrocities between the Serbs, the Croats, and the Bosniaks. But the reason there was a reaction against the Serbs is that the initial conditions were the Serbs within the Yugoslav army were crushing attempts by, I believe it was Slovenia, to become independent. And so really bad initial impression. And obviously it stuck with us for almost a decade. I mean, served the Serbians right for not being able to anticipate that. Russia is the same thing. I don't think it was, and I give Clinton more credit in foreign policy. I don't think Clinton thought that Russia was irrelevant. I think he thought, what, we can't, on the one hand, we don't want Russia to collapse. On the other hand, we can't associate with Russia. Look at the way they run their domestic colonial system. At the time, I mean, today things are relatively more quiescent, but Dagestan in the 90s was a disaster. The KGB were, picking up people in the middle of the night. The U.S. cannot associate with that kind of country. And and the biggest issue, which I associate with my university. I mean, you may remember Pussy Riot jumping topless into the St. Basil's in Red Square. I mean, that was from my university. Those musicians. There's this endless wave of NGOs that we in the West are not empowered to stop, and this was infuriating to the Russians, obviously, because they're a traditional society, and a lot of the people that back these NGOs also has certain commercial interests. That it's a rough environment. I wish we could have done something to expose Russia less aggressively. To the real state of the international system. We failed, obviously. It's only one last point. And again, with great respect, I was looking at the books you published. I am eagerly going to read more than just one of your books. I find the topic fascinating. But from a normative standpoint, what I got to say just kills me is, and I'm not accusing you, I think this is more the American approach, is they're patronizingly expending Eastern Europeans again. I mean, they did it after World War I. They did it, during the Cold War, basically not considering the effect of the Warsaw Pact occupation on Eastern Europeans, and they're doing it again. Obviously, politics is complex, but if Ukrainians want to fight, who are the Americans to tell them we're going to come in and save you? It's idiotic, and the lack of faith. Or rather, the lack of good faith is so obvious that the Americans don't elaborate on it. Well, when I mean the Americans, I mean Trump, of course, and the MAGA supporters. The U.S.'s treatment of indigenous people in the U.S. is that's all you need to delegitimize the U.S. policy recommendations for a small country on another continent. But again, thank you very much for your presentation. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you, Jillian and Jack.
Thank you, Jim.
Oh, sorry, Jack. I accidentally just unmute.
Thank you, Professor. I caught into the presentation a little late. I tend to agree with everything that you were saying when I tuned in. I look at this as being Germany and Russia have been at war for like 4 centuries. It's not like Germany was going to win, and it's not like Europe was going to be able to use as the comment was just made, the battleground across Ukraine the killing of Eastern Europeans, or as you were saying when I first tuned in, the idea that we seem to go to war without considering consequences or costs. The United States has done this repeatedly in my understanding of the world. I don't really examine history like Jim or you maybe. I'm a science guy. I'm not a historian guy. But I always see that when they go to war with scant resources or somebody else's troops or some other cause that seems to be wrapped in some type of packaging, it really is not going to be a fight for the goals that can be enunciated clearly or fundamentally. I remember in 2015, Jim and I were talking about some of the leftover players in Ukraine that might not be very savory, that might be formerly German-style stormtrooper types. And I'm not thinking that really continued to be what I believed. So what you gave me just now is a new understanding of this, which is that the United States should have been very aware and very supportive of how Russia operated in World War II to save our and Europeans' circumstances. And our desire to turn Germany into the fall guy here. I don't even know if that's true. I just realized when Germany was losing its gas and it was coming through Ukraine from Russia or from Dagestan or from Uzbekistan or wherever it was, the wars that the United States instituted in Iraq and in other parts of the world over energy or for other countries' interests were failures. And we keep failing the same way again and again and again and again and again. Why were we in Vietnam? Why were we in Iraq? Why were we in Afghanistan? We're just wasting our time, wasting our money, and buying bad press from people around the world that may want to live in peace and not necessarily, pay for the devastation and destruction that we wrought upon them for no good reason except that we think we can or we can get away with it. I don't know what to say because I've taken myself to the dead end of what I believe has occurred in this situation. So is there anything to say about why do we keep making these same mistakes? I think we made this mistake in World War I. I think that was pointed out by somebody else. I think we made this mistake in the mentioning of the Korean War, the mentioning of the Vietnam War, the mentioning of Iraq War. So I'll stop there and ask you if this is just another wasted American adventure so we could spend money building up our military industrial complex while we collapse economically and politically and socially in the United States.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of recent American history has been quite sobering. And the more we get into the documents, get into the archives, and we can see how they were reasoning, particularly the Vietnam War. You read the documents and they seem completely insane. The people who were driving the United States further and further into a quagmire at the expense of so many young people's lives. I'm afraid statesmen all too easily get heady on power. Power is like a form of enriched alcohol for some people.
Well, and I want to just point out that we were talking to Professor Haslam on his new book on Hubris, the American origins of Russia's war against Ukraine. These events, of course, are partly marketing selling functions. So we encourage people to buy the book because there's just so much we haven't even covered here. And it's best to look at the book and sort of take it in stride. We haven't talked about, the whole question of nuclear weapons in 1994, the whole question of disarmament. We haven't talked about the coup in Maidan. We haven't talked about Putin's policy after 9/11. All these issues are very important to try to understand this. And it's a great, great pleasure to have Professor Haslam on with us. We hope to have you on again. Michael, try to be brief if you can. I'm going to unmute you. Mike?
Right, got it. Okay, well, the thing I wanted to say is just going on my original question, which I think I probably didn't present it correctly, is that if the United States is, shall we say, isolated, friendless, has the attitude that a lot of the MAGA people have, which is that I've got my own problems, why should I care about you? If it's on, I mean, wouldn't the United States in any negotiation with Russia, with Putin, wouldn't the United States be on the back foot? And I also wanted to bring in with the nuclear arms, because that does have to do with agreements we made with Ukraine as far as they're giving up their nuclear arms. The fact that you can call it a deep state or whatever you want to call it, but we did make agreements, and if we break our agreements, doesn't that mean that we are not a trustworthy partner in negotiations?
Yeah, but the 1994 agreements were that the Ukraine gives up the nuclear capability on its territory. The thing was, Ukraine didn't have the command and control systems for those nuclear weapons were in Moscow. So, in other words, these weapon systems were redundant for the Ukrainians. They were expensive to maintain safely. The United States was particularly concerned that none of these weapons or the nuclear fuel fall into the hands of dangerous people outside, and that's why they went for those agreements. It had nothing to do with the NATO issue or the war that has taken place in the last few years. It was another issue entirely. The agreements were not ratified by Moscow. It wasn't a treaty. The Russians never felt they had any particular commitment, or certainly Putin never did. I would agree that certainly if you look at it from the American side, you would wonder why other countries should support the United States in what it's doing. But, international relations is really about power. Mm. And the United States, for good or ill, and we've discussed some of the ill at quite some length. And for my generation, it was Vietnam. Power counts. And when you're dealing with the Russians, it counts more, perhaps, than with anyone else. They understand power. When you've lost your empire, it really makes you sensitive to issues of power. So when the US was dealing with post-Soviet Russia, it was dealing with a country which, as it were, mentally was trying to grapple with its loss of status, its loss of material power, the loss of empire. I mean, you must remember France. When France lost the empire under de Gaulle, it made dealing with France incredibly difficult. They were hypersensitive at every point. They wouldn't negotiate in English. English books were not encouraged. They were worried about the infiltration of English into the French language, which the Académie Française was trying to prevent. Almost paranoia. When Mrs. Thatcher decided to send the fleet to liberate the Falkland Islands from Argentina, and I was watching with horror on the television as the fleet left Portsmouth or Plymouth, and I was thinking, oh my God, I might be called up at any moment, because I'd been in the territorials at school, and I could be called up to go and fight on godforsaken land at the other end of the world to defeat an Argentinian dictator, it does bring things home to you. Power is what counts. Trump has the power. He doesn't really care whether the Europeans like him or not. And if I were running the United States, I'd do the same. You've got to get this war has to be ended.
Well, on that sobering note, and listen, thank you so much. This has really been a lot of fun. We hope to have you come again and talk because, as you can see, most of the discussion was focused on the present. we barely touched your book in depth. We basically were talking about the kind of things that we're going through right now as Americans and as citizens of the world. And of course, it's just really, really great to have you here, Jonathan, today. It was a great pleasure. Thank you so much for taking time to spend with us. We hope to see you again sometime soon. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Jim.